Transformations have now made a return to the series through them being added in this Elden Ring DLC. There are 3 in total, some of them actually adding some pretty decent buffs. So we are going to be ranking all of them alongside the new consumable buffs, which a lot of these buffs have just been power crept from the base game. They're just like the same things that you have in the base game, but just like a slightly upgraded version. Some of them are just kind of useless, other ones are actually pretty decent. So we're just going to talk about how useful all of these things are in a PvE setting. But yeah, let's just get started. Starting off at the bottom, we have Spirit Raisin. This is an item that is actually meant to be fed to Torrent. Actually does buff him to where his sprints turn into a shockwave and actually can knock those smaller enemies backwards. This kind of makes it easy to just like run through certain types of areas, which is great. The buff lasts a minute. It's not bad by any means. It definitely works and it's nice to have, but I just question why he just didn't have this ability by default. Why is it tied behind an item that we have to feed to him every single minute? It would have been cool if we just had this skill by default and then this item just helped boost the damage of that charge attack. Because yeah, this thing just does terrible damage, which is just annoying because when we get hit by a stampeding horse, it's like we're like an anime villain that just got punched by the protagonist after a time skip. But then our horse doesn't have those capabilities at all. He like tickles the enemies as he's going past them. So it's not a bad buff, it's just very niche and it's like inconvenient to have to keep constantly using the buff over and over again. Number 15, the Lamenter's Mask. This is going to be one of the 3 transformations in this game. Now, to use a transformation, you have to have no armor equipped, and it will change the form of your character. Now, when transformed, you do gain a little bit to your damage negation, but it is only 5% to every damage type except for Holy, which is going to give you a 20% damage negation boost. So it's still not going to be that good. You are going to take a lot of damage while in this transformation. But the benefit is that you do gain +8 to Arcane, and when using the item again when transformed, you actually do this like headbutting attack that does like a whole bunch of nothing. The attack scales of strength, but it just does terrible damage, doesn't go that far, and it's not going to be like the quickest thing in the world either. You're probably going to get hit a lot of times when trying to use it, and you're just not going to have much damage negation. So it definitely doesn't make for a very good pairing, and the +8 that you get to Arcane is just not worth it, especially because there are armor pieces in this game that just give you more Arcane without any negative side effects, so you could just use those instead. Number 14, I want to talk about both of the Scorpion Stews. Now, the first one is just meant for a quest line until you actually end up getting the gourmet version, and you can only get like a couple of these per playthrough, so it's not really something you're going to be using a whole bunch, because, you know, you can't really farm for these things. But the buff itself is actually pretty decent. It actually does give you health regen and damage negation for the next minute. It actually is going to be 12 HP per second, and it plus 10% to your physical damage negation. Now, it is going to be 2 separate buffs, the damage negation being a body buff, and the healing buff is just going to be a unique buff. So if you wanted to, you could use a boiled crab to just gain a better physical damage negation buff, and you'll still retain the really good health regen. But the only benefit of actually having this thing equipped would just be for the Mimic tier, because you could summon the Mimic, and he can actually use the Scorpion Stew throughout the fight, and actually won't consume your one. Because unfortunately for us, we can only really use it like twice per playthrough. Number 13, I want to touch on all the new livers. There's going to be pickled liver in this game now, of which does give you 25% more elemental damage negation, depending on which one that you actually do use. Which compared to the regular dried liver, those ones only give you 15%. Except for the holy version, for some reason that one gives you 35%. So that one is literally just better than like the new version that we have right now. So the holy proof pickled liver is quite literally useless. But I think that most of these things are just not really that useful to begin with, and that's because the fortification spells exist. These spells give you 35% damage negation to that particular element. And best of all yet, these things only have a 10 faith requirement. You can use these with any single type of build. Just equip it, put on a seal, doesn't have to be upgraded at all, and it's just going to give you a better buff. I don't know why more people don't use these things. Now yes, it is going to take up a spell slot, it is going to consume a little bit of FP, and it does last 90 seconds compared to like the liver lasting 120 seconds. But in terms of the convenience, not having to farm for anything, and the fact that the effect is just better as well, you might as well just use these spells. Number 12, Blessing of Marika. This is an item of which does completely restore your HP and heal all status effects. Now, these are going to be finite items. You can only get like a handful of these per playthrough. They cannot be farmed, and you can only hold one at a time. But being able to just heal completely to full and heal all status effects is going to be really clutch in a boss fight. So if you're in those moments when you're fighting like one of the DLC bosses and you have no heals left, you can just pop these things. But I think once again, the best use for this is going to be with the Mimic tier. As long as you have it in your inventory, the Mimic tier actually can use it and actually won't consume it for you either. Number 11, Fingerprint Nostrum. This is a body buff that does give you +6 to Mind, Intelligence, Faith, and Arcane for 90 seconds, but it does actually decrease your HP, but it is only 3 HP per second, which over that 90 seconds, that's going to be less than 300 health, and it can be easily counteracted with health regen spells. And it's going to be very useful for like those split types of builds. If you have like split Faith and Intelligence or a Faith and Arcane build, you're just getting a bunch more points in those stats. Now, unfortunately for Mind, it's kind of annoying because it does actually increase the FP bar, but it doesn't like fill it up. It just leaves like a blank space there, which is kind of annoying. So it's not really much of a benefit. And also, if you just do have like a pure faith or a pure intelligence build, you're also not going to really benefit off it much. But I think like the two major drawbacks is that one, it is very inconvenient to try and like craft these things. It requires like a lot of like annoying items to farm. And it actually is a body buff. So therefore, it's going to actually remove things like Flame Grant Me Strength, Hellish Brewery, other damage negation types of spells, which in most cases, I would just rather have those instead. Number 10, Ancient Dragon's Blessing. This is a finite item of which for 15 FP it does give you 10% more damage negation for 70 seconds. Now it is also going to serve as an aura buff, so it is not going to stack with things like Golden Vow, and Golden Vow already does give you a damage negation boost. And the spell specifically does also give you 10% more damage negation, but it also gives you 15% more damage, and that also just lasts longer as well. But this thing obviously doesn't have requirements, so if you don't have a faith build, you could just use this. Now, unfortunately, it is a finite item, but you actually can acquire an infinite amount of these. If you do go to the Dragon Communion Priestess after every single time that you use it, she actually will give you another one for free. Now, once you do progress her questline far enough, or once you kill Baal, she is no longer accessible, of which you can't actually grab these items anymore. Which is unfortunate because it is pretty cheap, it's a quick cast, and it's just going to be just a bunch of damage negation, and it will stack with all of your body buffs. But it's not going to be that big of a deal still, because you could just use the Golden Vow Ash of War or the Golden Vow Consumable. They're not going to give you as much damage negation, they're not going to really last as long either, but these are also just going to boost your damage, and just having the bunch more damage alongside more damage negation, I'm just going to value more. So although it is pretty nice, there's not really much of a reason to use it over Golden Vow. Number 9, I want to touch on both the Dragon Communion Flesh and the Dragon Scale Flesh. Both of these things have very similar effects, just at slightly different points. The Dragon Communion Flesh does give you +6 to your Vigor, Strength, and Dexterity, also gives +5% to your Stamina. However, it does actually drain 3 HP per second. And as for the Dragon Scale Flesh, this actually does give you +8 to your Vigor, Strength, and Dexterity, and boost your Stamina by 10%. And in terms of the HP drain, it is going to be 4 HP per second. Now, as I mentioned with the Fingerprint Nostrum, the HP drain is barely noticeable, and over the 90 seconds of which the buff does last, you're not going to be really losing much HP. Now, it's obviously going to be dependent on your build. If you haven't reached the soft caps for certain types of stats, then these are going to be very nice. The stamina boost is probably going to be the best thing because it actually is a percentage-based buff and not just like a flat amount. So you're actually going to gain more returns out of this one. Especially if you are going to go with the Dragon Scale Flesh, this is actually very good. Now, the unfortunate things is that the Dragon Communion Flesh does require you to actually farm a bunch of these like annoying crafting materials, and the Dragon Scale Flesh is going to involve you killing dragons, which is just not that fun. And it also is going to be a body buff, so it's not going to stack with things like Flame Grant Me Strength or damage negation spells. Number 8, I want to talk about both the Golden Horn Tender and the Silver Horn Tender. These are just going to be upgraded version of the Pickled Foul Feet. The Silver Horn is going to give you +60 to your item discovery, and the Golden Horn is actually going to give you +40% to your rune acquisition, and both actually do last 3 minutes. Now, these are obviously going to be really good. If you stacked up on a whole bunch of these, just using the silver ones to just like farm for items is going to be great. And if you did want to do some like rune farming, or after you've killed a boss that does drop a bunch of runes, you could just consume this item, and it'll just give you 40% more runes for free basically. So they're great to use if you have them because they're really good for item and rune farming. But the problem is that if you want to get more of them, you have to farm for them, which is just ironic. You have to farm for the items that just help you for farming. Like in the time that you actually spent trying to farm gold horn tenders, you're better off just spending that time actually just doing some rune farming instead. And same thing with the silver horn tender. Unless you are a person that is planning to do a lot of item farming for like armor sets and weapons, then maybe it might be better to like just try and farm for a bunch of silver horns beforehand. But for the most part, these are going to be items that you're just going to want to use and not really farm for. Number 7, I want to talk about all of the brand new greases. No, I'm not going to rank them all because depending on the situation might be dependent on which grease is best for you. But most of these greases are just going to be upgraded from like the base game versions. There is going to be a new fire, lightning, magic, and holy based one. And these are actually going to give you +120 more elemental damage, which compared to like the regular grease, they only give you +85. There is going to be the Eternal Sleep Grease, which is just going to give Eternal Sleep instead of regular sleep. The Dragon Communion Grease is going to be better than like the Dragon Wound Grease. It actually does give you 38% more damage to regular dragons and 28% more damage to ancient dragons, which is actually very good. Any single dragon that you fight, you can just throw this on and it will do so much more damage. There is also the Festive Grease that gives you a boost to rune acquisition, but it's based on hits, so every single hit gives you 25 runes, which is useless. But the reason why I don't really value grease as much in this game, because most of the best weapons in the game typically can't be buffed. And in terms of the ones that can be buffed, they're probably either better paired alongside elemental infusions, or they're going to be blade-based weapons, of which you'd rather use something like Blood Flame Blade. And some of the Ash of War buffs are just going to be like really good too. Something like Royal Knight Resolve or Crag Blade are just going to be much better than like all the grease in the game. But there are going to be certain circumstances of which you are using like a damaging-based weapon skill, and you do have room for a buff of which you can just throw in grease. It is going to be just more damage. Now, plus 120 damage is still not going to be that good, especially in the DLC, because it's going to give you a flat amount to AR. And in the DLC, where you have Scatter Tree Fragments, you can have like a greatsword with like over 2000 AR. Having a plus 120 isn't going to really be doing much, especially if it's like split elemental damage. Now, if you're going up against an enemy that is weaker to that particular damage type, it might be pretty good. But another annoying thing, in the previous games, you could just buy weapon buffs for souls. But in this game, you have to farm for them. But like if you can equip it, you might as well, because it is just going to be a bit more damage. Number 6, the Priestess Heart, of which is another transformation in this game. When you do have no armor equipped, you can use this item to transform yourself into a dragon. You actually will gain 7% damage negation. And upon using the item again when transformed, you do gain plus 20% to your dragon cult incantations, which is basically going to be all of your lightning-based spells, which do involve things like Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, so you can just get even more damage with a spell like this. Now, there are going to be some problems with this transformation. And the major one being is that the Death Knight set also exists. This armor set does just give you 8% more damage to your Dragon Cult incantations, which yes, is going to be a lower number. So if you did want to maximize your damage, I recommend just using the Priestess Heart. But there are going to be a few more benefits that the Death Knight set has. One, it's going to be a passive buff. Therefore, you don't have to keep using the buff over and over again. Two, it's actually going to give you respectable damage negation and some respectable poise to where you actually can tank attacks and potentially trade out. And it actually also does boost certain types of weapon skills, where the Priestess Heart does not, so it's going to get better synergy there too. So it's not like the Priestess Heart is bad at all, it's just that I'd rather have the Death Knight set because it's just much more reliable. Number 5, the Well-Pickled Turtle Neck. This actually does boost your stamina recovery speed by 30%, and it actually does last a minute. And the best thing about this, it actually is going to be a unique buff, so it stacks with like healing spells, body buffs, aura buffs. It basically stacks with everything, and it just throws it on top, and this is going to give you a bunch more stamina recovery speed. It's like one of the most important things to have in this game, because it just means that you can just output more damage quicker, and it's be a lot more risky in your fights, and you won't be punished as much. It's just an amazing item to always have. Now, the only problem is that the farm is not fun. There are going to be a few items of which you do need to actually craft them, and some of them are just going to be pretty obnoxious farms. But if you do put the time and effort in, you do get an item that can actually help you out with a lot of boss fights. Number 4, Golden Vow. Yes, it is now in the form of an item, and it does work basically the exact same way. It does give you 15% more damage and 8.8% damage negation for the next 45 seconds, which is going to be like a slightly different number than the other Golden Vows. For comparison, the damage is actually going to be just as much of a boost as the spell-based version. The damage negation is going to be like in between both the Ash of War and the spell, but it does last just as long as the Ash of War at that 45 seconds. It is also going to consume less FP as well. So basically, this is just going to be a direct upgrade of the Ash of War because it just does not have requirements. Typically, you would just use Golden Vow onto a dagger and just use that before every single boss fight, but now you could just use the Golden Vow consumable, and it's just going to be a better version. It is an aura buff, so it is going to stack with other types of body buffs and health regen spells, and it's just going to be more damage and more damage negation to every single build. Now, the problem is, once again, trying to farm for it is not fun. The items of which it does require in the Blessed Bone Shards are not easy to come by. Hopefully, they actually change it to where they drop a little bit better, because as it stands right now, you're doing a lot of farming just to get an item that is a bit better than the Golden Vow Ash of War, and it is worth it. But for convenience sake, I'm still just going to use the Golden Vow Ash of War. Number 3, the Lulling Branch. This actually does give you 5 FP per second for the next 60 seconds, but it does actually periodically build up sleep buildup on yourself. And it is to the point where like in that 60 seconds, you're more than likely going to get procced with sleep, which is definitely not ideal in the middle of a boss fight. However, it is only going to proc once, and if you use things like a Clarifying Horn Charm or a Stimulating Bolus, it is just a complete non-issue, and it's just going to be free FP. You can just use these as a replacement to just like your Cerulean Flasks, which is obviously great because you can just stack up on a bunch of healing flasks, and that just means more survivability in a boss fight. And these are just going to be like a direct upgrade to the Starlight Shards, which unlike the Starlight Shards, you can actually farm for these ones. And you actually can stack it alongside with that, and you can put it alongside the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, and you can get so much FP regen over like the next minute. But once again, the problem is that trying to farm for these things is not fun. Some of the items just have very rare drop rates, and it's going to involve you farming for like hours to just get a whole bunch of them. So like the reward is really good, but trying to get there is just, it's not really worth it. Number 2, Sacred Bloody Flesh. This is a very interesting and complicated item, but it's very good, especially for those bleed types of builds. Now, how it works is that it is a body buff that lasts 30 seconds. It does give you plus 7% more damage and plus 10 to your arcane stat, which yes, doesn't really sound like it's much. However, when you do proc bleed while the buff is active, you do gain 18% more damage, and it just adds 20 seconds to the counter. So yes, it kind of works like the Lord of Blood Exaltation Talisman and the White Mask, and it actually is going to stack with those things. And it's going to be a very decent buff because it's 18% on top of that 7% that you actually got when you initially used the buff itself. And every single time that you proc bleed, it's just going to reset that 20-second timer. And after those 20 seconds do wear off, it's just going to go back to the original timer and pick up from where it left off. So you can actually make this buff last forever as long as you are constantly proccing bleed. And once it does wear off, you can just use it again because you can hold up to 10 of these things. But yes, it is going to be a finite item, which once again, you're going to have to farm for it. Now, thankfully, the farm isn't actually that bad. These are not craftable items, but you can just actually have these drop off enemies. And if you go stack up on some item discovery based stuff, you can actually stack up on a whole bunch of these things after like an hour or so of farming. So if you do have those bleed type builds and you just want to like melt bosses even quicker somehow, you could just use something like this. Number 1, I'm going to go with the Rock Heart, of which is another transformation in this game, of which when you do have no armor equipped and you use the transformation, it will 1, actually give you plus 10% to all of your damage negation, which is actually higher than all of the other transformations in the game. And when you use the item while transformed, it does give you plus 20% to your Dragon Communion incantations for the next 60 seconds. But yeah, this is going to be the reason why this gets number 1, because the Dragon Communion incantations are like the best spell type in the entire game. All of those breath attacks just do so much damage. You get access to every single damage type. They go insanely far. They can bounce off walls. You get access to status effects too. And then you have like the melee-based versions like Dragon Maw and Dragon Claw, of which can just do like amazing damage and amazing stance damage. You just get such great coverage for like every single type of situation. And there are so many buffs for these things, and you can just add on something like the Rock Heart and just get 20% even more damage. Now, yes, it does involve you having to be like almost naked because you're not going to have much damage negation. But another good thing about transformations is that it doesn't weigh anything. So in most cases, you're always going to be light rolling as well. Anyway, that is the ranking. I honestly don't really like how I ranked them. I could probably do it again tomorrow and it could be like a completely different list, but that does not matter. What I say about these things is what's actually important. How I rank them is not. But please do let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And in terms of the next video, I'm probably just going to cover like the top 10 best weapons in the game, including the base game and DLC. Because I am getting a lot of questions about like the best weapons because some of them did get nerfed just before the DLC and I haven't really talked about them yet. So I might as well just make a video. And also please do follow me on Twitch as well because that's where I do all of my testing and all my challenge runs. So if you are interested in that stuff, give me a follow there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.